Welcome, everyone, to the Talent Revolution Tales from the Trenches. I'm Joe Shambon.
And I'm Jill Caniglio-Kirk.
Jill, I was thinking about the next topic, and wouldn't it be awesome to have a system or a silver bullet so you can find the right people, get the right fit, and increase your retention?
Joe, I've been dreaming about that for a very long time. So if that were possible, it would be too good to be true.
Well, and don't worry, TA teams, you're still going to be needed. You're always going to be hiring. So to welcome into the next topic is Martin Gibbons. Martin, welcome to the show.
Welcome. Good to have you. Thank you.
For everyone who doesn't know Martin, Martin is an entrepreneur, author, and leading voice in recruitment, retention, and workplace psychology. As a founder of peoplemaps.com, Martin has spent more than 2 decades helping organizations understand what truly drives performance, engagement, and long-term success in the workplace. His work challenges traditional hiring methods by focusing on personality, behavior fit, and the factors that determine whether people thrive in a role or quickly move on. Again, welcome to the show, Martin, and anything else you'd like to add about your background and your current work?
I think that pretty much covered it, to be honest. Yeah, this is a life's work. 26 years or something I've been doing this side of things. So yeah, it kind of sneaks up on you, but clearly this is an obsession. Possibly not a healthy one either, but yeah, we've been doing this a while.
Martin, what got you interested in this? Maybe you can share a little bit about your why. What got you interested in this topic specifically?
Okay, well, profiling in general, that came about probably more as a happy accident. I was the world's worst physicist and came across, and I was working with internet technology back in I'm talking pre-Google here. There's not many of us can remember pre-Google, but yeah, that was kind of me. And we came across profiling. I was actually in a workshop and we were doing some stuff and came across profiling and just thought it was the most amazing thing. And that started this whole journey, really. In our early days at People Maps, we worked a lot with job seekers and we had sort of partnerships with all the big job boards, all the newspapers and stuff. And then we moved gradually on to B2B when we discovered actually that loads of agencies were using our product, wrongly, which was designed for job seekers. And we discovered that employers were using it. And we thought, well, maybe we should give them an actual product that does it properly. We've kind of developed that side of things really for the last sort of 10, 15 years. That's been the growing side of the business, really.
Very exciting. Well, we'd love to dig into this topic. And one thing that really amazes me is all this effort we put in recruitment, all this effort we put in ATS engines and processes and 8-step processes and panel interviews often results in 50% of all hires failing. Tell us more about that. And tell us why.
It's an interesting statistic, actually. It's not mine, it's from REC, which is, I think, a UK trade body. But they're basically saying about 50%, just under, I think it's 48% or something, that fail or are classed as failures within 18 months. Now, what is a failure? What is a success? Somewhere along the line, nobody's delighted, and that's, so where that line is probably up for discussion. But at the end of the day, what I want for people is that the employee is delighted, the manager's delighted, and the business is delighted. Everybody needs to get a win on these hires, and that's probably not happening as often as people would like, despite all the work and the effort and the technology that is currently available.
Your work is really centered around how do we assess things up front to kind of get rid of some of that noise to really focus on, is that fit there? Is that a fair assessment of the tool?
Yes, I think it was actually a client of mine that really told me what business I was in, which was really, no, you're about making things fit. And I thought, actually, yeah, I couldn't see that myself, of course, at the time, but that's pretty much how it has panned out. And that's the area I've really focused in the last few years. And that came about through some pretty big breakthroughs, if you like, the inadequacies, the shortfalls of what a CV is providing, that skills, qualifications and experience, and how poorly that informs whether this person's going to love this job and be naturally wired to do the job. And that was the real big change.
Yeah, that word naturally definitely resonates with me, because I think anyone who's worked in my space as an HR professional for 25 plus years can see that people can do certain jobs and they can adapt their personality profiles to fit a role. But when that's not natural, I think when they're under stress and over time, that engagement and all these other issues crop up. So that word naturally definitely clicks with me because I've seen some people work really hard at the successful part of keeping themselves in the right profile to perform, but it's not at all natural.
Yeah, and this is all about natural. This is about going with what feels naturally, not forcing things, and because that is unsustainable fundamentally. I mean, humans, don't get me wrong, humans are incredible, right? They're incredibly adaptable. They can pretty much do anything that they really set their mind to. However, you really shouldn't have to. The more that you're pedaling uphill, and I quite often use a wee image of Mr. Bean riding his bicycle. I don't know if you're familiar with Mr. Bean at all, but there's a great clip in one of his films where he's pedaling this old bicycle and he passes a whole peloton of sleek cyclists. The idea behind this is that if you're doing what comes naturally to you, then you're pedaling downhill. And I don't care who you are. If the race is, I get to pedal downhill and you have to pedal uphill, it's pretty obvious who's going to win that race, and easily. And that's fundamentally what I'm trying to do in the recruitment arena, if you like.
I've seen other assessments and other tools that showcase the natural and the work behavior that has to go on. And I'm using air quotes for folks listening. But I think you're right, is the work behavior is done, you always tend to go back to the natural world, right? I mean, it's only sustained for so long. That's the nomenclature, what you're basically saying, right?
Yeah, you can adapt for a little bit, right? You take attention to detail. Now, I spent years working and studying in high tech, right? Good grief, I used to design offshore gas systems, and that worries me to this day, to be honest, that there's people out there that might rely on those, because it took me years before I discovered that my natural attention to detail is about 34%, right? That's not somebody you want near health and safety, right? That's me and Homer Simpson are both qualified to operate a nuclear power station, but we really shouldn't be, right? That's kind of what's going on. And that was one of those early discoveries for me was, actually, yeah, I'm not that detailed. I thought I was because I developed some coping mechanisms that allowed me to do science and pass that. And I think it was McPherson was one of my profs at uni. My degree was in applied physics originally, and McPherson was a proper physicist, big Scotsman, played rugby for Scotland at one time. And he said, and what is gravity? And I said 10. And you'd thought I'd set fire to the building. Not 10, Sonny, what are you talking about? It's 9.81 meters per second. Anything else is the wrong answer, right? And I just see it as 10 because, it's pretty close. So detail's not really my thing. And it took me years before I discovered that. And I suspect most people out there are in the same kind of situation and they don't quite know. And they're wondering why nothing quite feels right or fits. Now, you can adapt for a wee while, but sooner or later, you will come back to center your normal, natural, preferred way of doing things. And the word I use mostly is preference. It's your preferred way, not what you can or can't do. And I think this is where industry gets it wrong. Can I do details? Yeah, I can rock a spreadsheet with the best of them for about 20 minutes, and then I'm losing the plot. And so if you're needing detailed work done most of the time, you need someone who's naturally detailed because they will go off on that. That's totally happy place. Everybody else is pedaling uphill, even if they can do it. Does that make sense?
Yeah. It's awesome to recognize it though, right? That's what some of these assessments do, is recognize where you're pedaling uphill and you have to work harder at. And I had a story around that, and where it's exactly on the attention to detail and reviewing offer letters, and their natural tendency wasn't the attention, and I kept catching mistakes and they kept getting frustrated, even though they knew that they were, needed to take the second and the third look. So totally recognize and been in that situation before. So on the 50%, I got to ask this side of it, is it the behavioral or the technical side that you think that the 48% or so fail?
This is the interesting one. So it really is determined, what do we mean by fit is fundamentally what you're asking there. And what we discovered fundamentally was every work environment has its own demands that it places on every individual, right? And they're pretty unique. So what we're looking at is, what are the actual demands of that work environment? What's it like in a human way every day, most of the time, right? Because I say people can stretch and do things for those occasions when it's needed, but we're talking about most of the time, what is it mostly demanding of an individual? And once you understand that, now the reality is almost nobody does. I ask people this question and I've never once had anybody be able to give me an answer to that one. Because they're looking at, they're used to writing job descriptions. And the last thing a job description tells you is what it's like. What is it going to expect of you in terms of your day-to-day? And once you understand what that is, only then can you compare a candidate and go, does this person's natural preferences align with what those demands will be every day? And that's all to do with behavior. It's nothing to do with skills, qualifications, or experience. It's purely how is that? What's that going to demand from? And this is why one person's ideal job is the next person's nightmare job, even though it's the same thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I know on a previous episode, we talked about job descriptions. And one thing that I brought up was saying, I like talking to individuals about their jobs. I like having the person doing the job tell me about their job and what is it like? Because to me, that's a very different lens than talking to their leader about what are the responsibilities, right? And getting that context, getting that, tell me about a day this week and what you did, right? Tell me beyond this piece of paper and these responsibilities. What is it like to be in this job? And that's another reason I think these testimonials that companies do from employees are a great idea, because it's kind of a two-way street. It's a lens into the role for the individual on the other side, and it's kind of the person portraying this is what it's like to be here in this role. So that certainly clicks with me. And I think it's often a missing element of what is it really like? We could talk about deliverables, we could talk about outputs and qualifications, but what is a day in the life like? That's generally not captured in anything a recruiter is using, an HR professional is using, and a leader is using to look through the lens of selecting the right candidate.
And that's what the individual experiences every day. That's the bit. And if that's a nice alignment, if it's a good fit, then the job, they're pedaling downhill. The job comes easy. What it demands, well, that's what I happen to do anyway. That's how it responds. Anything else is now square pegs into round holes.
Mm-hmm.
And we do have a tendency just to batter the peg harder, either ourselves or our boss, thinking that that's the solution, but really you're just making a bigger problem. It's only a matter of time before that becomes a real problem.
So, I mean, that dives into understanding the role, the intake or strategy session, that really understand what's the day in the life for then recruiters to go find. But then it translates in how do we then take that into the CVs and the resumes and into the interviews? So, why don't the CVs and interviews tell the whole story of a person, and if the right fit comes into it? What are your thoughts on there, Martin?
Well, I'll take a recent case study just I'm working on. This is actually a 15-month. We're into, I think, month 15 of this pilot. And great company, good wage, contact center, but quite high-end stuff. This is not cutting edge. This is, really established. Hellish new hire retention. Just people coming and going. Nobody understood why the agency couldn't understand it, because they're going, we're giving you really good people. And they were annoyed because they're getting it in the neck for, hey, these people keep leaving. It must be your fault. And they're going, But the agency also knew this is a good company. There's not fundamentally anything wrong here. We've dealt with them for years. What's going on? So I get dragged in. We look at the situation. And what we discovered when we did the analysis, when we look at the existing people that are doing well there, and then that gives us some markers and some models. We look for patterns there. And there was very, very strong patterns. And then when we scratched the surface even deeper and talked to a couple of people and discovered what the environment's like, essentially, if I was to summarize it, it was they were speaking to people who were 70 and 80 years old every day. There was no hard selling to be done. And really the job was fundamentally shut up and listen. That was the job. No selling, no pushing, no doing things, and almost nobody can do that. And you could do it for a week, maybe. Now and again you'll pull it together, but almost nobody can sustain that. That's purely right into your DNA. You either are somebody who can, or the rest of us. And the one change, and only change we made in that whole situation was, right, let's only shortlist people who clearly displayed those types of natural preferences where they would let you talk all day and wouldn't feel the need to butt in or say a word. And we can identify those people, right? That's a really strong obvious behaviour pattern. We're 15 months in, and I think one, maybe two of the people that have been hired in that period have left. Their retention improved by it just disappeared. The whole turnover issue just went away on that one issue. And that was all we did. And it was simply because they were putting really good candidates, most of them who were used to selling and doing stuff on the phone, but they were talkers, not listeners. And they were hating it. They were doing it and they were going, 2 weeks in, they're going, I'm too bored. This is doing my head in. And they would move on. And it wasn't anybody's fault.
Yeah, when you bring up an example like this, of course, being an HR person, I'm looking at it saying, well, could this be an opportunity as well to redesign a role potentially where there is a small population of people that fit this? Or could there be other ways, right, to kind of transform the role in a sense that that's a piece of it, but there's other components to it and things like that, of course. So you got my HR wheels turning there. So
yeah, some people realize that quite often the more common scenario I come across is that they realize there's actually two jobs. And sometimes you're asking people to you're looking for a tall, short person.
Yes.
You know?
Yes.
And then you go, and you look at it a wee bit closer and you go, this is two jobs, not one. It's an unreasonable. Nobody's going to enjoy this because they'll like this bit and hate that part, or they'll like this bit and hate that part. And that's the most common scenario I come across when you break it down, especially if there's a problem. This one was a little unusual because it was such a singular problem. It's a single issue. Normally the things are more complex than that. It's not straightforward. But this was a shoe-in, easy answer that was staring us all in the face, but nobody could see it. Coming back to your earlier question there, Joe, that's not on the CV. Can't be.
Martin, I am going to use tall, short person somehow this week. I love that. So thank you for that little nugget. But I want to also dive into, what about the interview? I think there's people like Joe and myself that think we're quite good at interviewing. We're quite good at getting to know things about you that we're not asking you through behavioral interviewing. So what's different about that process that doesn't lead to some of this information? Maybe can you talk a little bit about that?
Okay, so a couple of things. One, I think interviews are really important, right? So we get that caveat in. And I always want the decisions to sit with the humans. I think this is so crucial, and especially in an AI world, right? The challenge is that if interviews as they stand today solved the problem, we wouldn't have the problem, because I don't think there's a single person hired that isn't interviewed, right? So clearly, there is still something falling short on that. What I would say is in our reports, so all our reports are written as interview guides specifically. Right? They've only got one job, how to interview this person. So it tells you a little bit about them, but it's mostly about facilitating the right conversations. And I would also say, clearly both of you are quite different from most people who are in the interview situation, right? Because that's mostly handled by part-time amateurs. That's the reality. They've got a day job and they have to then interview staff now and again for another job, right? But they're at best, in the world, part-time amateurs. So the interview guide that we provide, this personality report, is focused more on helping them have the right kind of conversation, talk about the right stuff. And what that comes into is experience, right? So let's say you've got a candidate who maybe doesn't tick all the boxes, but you're quite liking some of the stuff that we're going on. Let's say there is a detail, we'll go back to the detail example, which is nice and easy to get your head around. Now, if that candidate throws their hands up and says, yeah, I know I'm not that detailed. I'm not terrible, but I'm not up there in the 80, 90% region. I'm a 50, 60% detailed person. But one, I'm aware of that. Now, that's a big thing, right? If somebody throws their hands up and says awareness, that already puts them into a pretty special category, because most people are not aware. The second thing is, and this is where work experience, the only thing relevant in work experience is, what have they figured out that lets them manage that? What have they figured out in their experience, through experience, that allows them to deal with detail when they have to, even though they know they're not that naturally detailed? That's the conversations you want in an interview. That's the stuff that allows you to make hiring decisions with confidence, because if they can do those two things, that's what matters. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
So it really dives into going back to the call center situation, is understanding the requirements of the job, right? What's really needed to then determine how do we then find the people, but then interview them to check off those behaviors and the tactical piece, but also the behavioral part of it. I mean, that's maybe breaking it down really, really simple, but that's what I'm hearing.
I try and keep most of this is at one level is simple, at another level nobody will figure it out, right? But I do think fundamentally there's some common sense here, and I do try and always bring us back to a relatively common sense, in your own world experience, does this make sense type approach to things. I mean, another thing I would mention here, and it's probably relevant, is that we never use the terms strengths and weaknesses. And this is fundamentally because they are completely situational, right? What is a strength in one situation might be a weakness in another. And there's no such thing, therefore, as a blanket strength that somebody has. It's only strength depending on the demands of that environment, again. So, coming back to your point there, Joe, it's always relevant to what are the demands of the environment. And I'll give you a nice, ridiculous case, but it's quite real. If we take enthusiasm, now, if I asked 100 people, if I asked you both, is enthusiasm, if somebody was very enthusiastic, would you see that as a strength? I suspect you'll both say yes. 99 people out of 100 would say, yeah, we like people to be enthusiastic. What if the job was as an undertaker, right? Do you really want to be encountering an enthusiastic undertaker on a day like that? Probably not, right? That would probably be actually a weakness in that scenario. And although that's a slightly ridiculous version of what we're saying, that's the kind of thing that's going on in multitudes in every situation every day.
Yeah.
And we're trying to move away from it.
No, it's a great example. And I was going to actually say enthusiasm. It depends, right? Because it really does. But I love that part. When should profiling be used? I mean, is there every situation, just some? I guess, what are your thoughts on, where do we use this in the process or organization?
Our framework, what we call our framework, is called Fit First Framework. Almost impossible to say. I'm going to get a t-shirt because I need to practice it. But the idea behind that is that we've moved profiling to the very beginning of the process. And this comes down to, again, a sort of breakthrough that we made some time ago, which was regardless of skills, qualifications, if the behavioural fit isn't right, skills, qualification, experience will not compensate for that. Nothing will. So you kind of need to get the fit reasonably right. Now, it doesn't need to be precise or exact, right? But you need to be in the ballpark. You can't be asking non-detailed people to do a lot of detail every day and expect that to work out. That's unrealistic, right? So getting that fit, and you need that at the beginning. So we've moved profiling, basically profile every applicant, and then use that data to help you decide who goes on the shortlist. And if I take that example, the big pilot that we've been doing, that was the only thing they changed. So the employer actually never saw any difference whatsoever in terms of their experience. The agency used the tool on their behalf. And all the agency did was they compared new applicants against the benchmark, and they only put people on the shortlist or even consider them. They didn't even read CVs or applications until, these 20 or these 50 are in the ballpark. Now let's look at them a bit closer. And what the agency found is that their whole job got suddenly an awful lot easier. They were spending less time, but it was more time with the right people. And that improved their life. The client was still just getting people passed through on the shortlist to interview. But now all of those people had the potential to do the most important thing that job demanded. And that was the fundamental difference.
Yeah, one question comes to mind for me, because I think if I went to 5 different people in my organization and asked them, what does this role need to be? They might say something different. So when you talk about building that profile, what's the optimal team and who do you include in that process to make sure that you're getting all facets of that right? I'm not sure if that makes sense to you, but I could see.
It's a good question. We do it 2 ways. We do historical modelling and environment modelling, right? So historical modelling is my favourite and preferred. Where basically you say, look, if you get 5 or 6 people or more who do this same job in the same place that you're delighted with, and they've been there a while, right? They need to be there at least a year, probably more. And for whatever reason, you don't need to justify it. You just need to go, I wish they were all like Joe or Jean or Bob. I just wish they're just great. They're just amazing. That's all we want is I wish I had more Bobs, right? And everybody can say that. Every workplace has that story going on. If we can get a handful of those, then we can analyse those results. And what we can look for is patterns. And almost invariably, you'll get 5 out of the 6 will be very similar in personality. And even you'll usually find that they all have certain things that are very strong in common. And that's your markers. So rather than using my opinion or the manager's opinion, we try and take as much opinion out of this as possible and let the data try and inform us.
Yeah.
So who's good? They're all good. What do they have in common? Okay, let's, again, a common sense argument. Let's now shortlist or hire people who are similar to our best people, at least in these regards. That's the best way of doing it.
Yeah, and I could see that being, lots of upside there from the perspective of removing bias, right? And looking at quantifiable results that drive, what are those patterns? So very interesting.
So in that situation, what happens if it's a niche role and there's only one, maybe someone else, and you're at, your example before of a call center, that's an easy sample, a better sample, I should say, because there's multiple people and multiple different things. But let's go to the niche world where, Joe, I need another one of these, or I need someone like this because that person's gone. And, where they turned to an agency and said, hey, find me another of this. Like, how do you do that when there's, limited number of profiles?
That's probably the majority of situations. As you say, contact centers are wonderful for us because we're dealing with statistical significance, lots of data. And in our world, it's fundamentally about the data. So the more data I've got, the more robust everything is. On the other end of that spectrum is exactly what you're talking about, Joe. So this is where we have our work environment questionnaire. Basically asks the employer, the manager, someone who is intimate with what that job is, a whole bunch of questions. But unlike most questions, these are all about, effectively, what's it like here? And it allows us to get a stronger feel for that environment. And then when we understand that environment, we can then compare candidates against that. In an ideal world, I would always go with historical modelling, but this is the closest next best thing because it allows us to do those one-off jobs where there is only one person, there might be nobody, and we're having to start from scratch. The good thing about the questionnaire is it forces that individual to properly think about what is it like here. It's not easy to just go over to the thing they're comfortable with is what they want, what the demands are, what the outputs will be. That's where they're usually very informed. But what's it like? They really struggle with that. And the questionnaire breaks that down so they're making it easy for them to answer easy questions, and that allows us to take that data and then come back and say, this is actually how that pans out.
Sure. So is that a sample then of, obviously, I'm assuming the hiring leader and maybe another like a customer of theirs in the sense that they're working with, like in an organization, and maybe their boss to get a triangular of assessment of that, what's it like? Or is it just the one?
It could be the manager. It doesn't really matter. It could be the manager. It could be another employee who maybe does the job as well. I would generally never model one person or two people because we do absolutely get outliers. We absolutely get people who, despite everything, somehow or other, you're brilliant at this, although I don't really know why. That happens, right? Humans are weird, and you have to always accept that could happen anytime, right? These are never absolutes. However, there is also statistical evidence that allows us to make generalizing, which are actually pretty accurate almost all of the time. So that's the other side of that. But never forget, humans are all unique, and they're all a bit odd and a bit weird and a bit special, and will always surprise you. And that's a nice thing. But you don't want an employer trying to fill a role that demands something special. I think when I start hearing that, alarm bells are going off for me. That it's you just don't know what you're looking for. You haven't taken the time to properly figure this out, because no job should depend on, if we just find a tall, short person, that'll be perfect. And you go, no, it's not going to happen, right? So
Right.
And it's to get better behavior from them, I think.
What's the optimal stage to conduct the profiling in the process? Do you start with interviews, then do profiling? Do you start with profiling, then do interviews? Is there a right or wrong answer there?
A profile right at the application stage would be our choice. Just profile everybody, use that data to decide where you're going to spend your time. Time's precious. Management's time's precious. HR's time's, talent team's time is precious. And if you're sitting, especially, as application numbers get larger, it's fine if you're sitting with 4 or 5 people, then no big deal. But you're sitting maybe looking at, I've had one client for a summer job, 1,000 applications in a zoo. Where do you start? And I know for a fact that once it gets 20, 30, 40 applications, well, a lot of that due diligence and process really goes out the window, and people are just going, yeah, I like the photo, don't like the photo. It gets very arbitrary as to how they start making shortlists.
Sure.
So we can give them something way less arbitrary, especially with those bigger numbers, where they'll always be spending their time with the people who are most likely to be a good fit and work out.
Right. Well, Martin, one thing we really like to do on our podcast is share stories. So do you have a tale to share? We call it Tales from the Trenches. Maybe how using this tool really had an impact on an organization, or really any just crazy story you'd like to share.
Well, I suppose there's quite a few of those, but again, I will come back to my local one recently also because it's a big one. So this was a company that are spending, they had about 70 vacancies a year. Staff turnover reckon it had gone from about 30% up to about 40%. Really caused them all sorts of problems. And they were spending about 100 grand a year with their agency, essentially refilling vacancies. And that was when we get brought in because budget's going out of control, management are going off their heads, and it's more and more money and poorer results. So once we implemented the solution, which really, I think the whole team, management team at HR had one Zoom call with me. That was it. That was all they did. They never did anything else. The agency, about the same. They just implemented it and got everybody to do the thing. So there was no big upheaval. And I think that surprises people because normally when you're looking at big changes like this, you're looking at massive upheaval. And we literally had none. But the difference is that where they had previously, in the previous year, previous 2 years, spent 100 grand, had to replace 50 to 70 people just to stand still. Right, just to maintain their numbers. We are now 15 months in and none of the people hired have left. Right? I think there's maybe one or two, right? So that's 50 people dropped from their vacancies. So there are 50 less vacancies this time than they did last year. And they were paying 2,000 just on agency fees, never mind all the other costs, and that's another discussion, but just in fees, they've saved 100 grand because there's 50 people they simply just didn't need to replace. And that is fundamentally at the new hire retention stage, right? So there's a thing we call the new hire success threshold. And what this is, nobody's measuring this, and it's one of the most crucial numbers. This is at what point are you quite happy to re-advertise that role, that vacancy? Right? Is it after 3 months, after 6 months, 12 months, 18 months? Now, there's also data out there that tells you typically it's 18 months before somebody's fully productive because now they know what the hell they're doing, right? But even if it was 12 months, so if anybody leaves within that 12-month window, you're paying twice or 3 times for the one vacancy because they haven't reached the threshold, so they haven't really been productive or made a proper contribution yet. And now they're gone. Now, if somebody's been with you 2 or 3 years and they get a promotion or they move on, stuff happens. We're not unrealistic in the world. That's reality. But people leaving within weeks or even days of starting, that is not an acceptable reality. It doesn't need to be like that. Once you've been there a while, other things are going to start influencing and annoying you, and manager gets a chance to finally piss you off so much you have to quit, right? But in those first few weeks, that's probably not happened yet. So the variables aren't huge. So there is a fixable problem. And I think separating out the long-standing from is this a new hire retention issue is quite fundamental. And again, nobody's really splitting that out sufficiently.
Well, I can't help but think of this euphoric state because I think in every organization I've worked in, there's teams where the fit's great and there's teams where the fit is almost impossible to get right. I think everyone who has done a job similar to mine can relate to certain functions really being kind of the squeaky wheel of why can't we get that right in that department, right? So I just look at it and say, if we were all looking through the same lens, using the same tools, how, incredible could the engagement levels be? Could all of those things be? And maybe it's an exercise for a company out there to say, I want to start with my squeaky wheel, right? And use this model and do this assessment. And then kind of go on from there as to, how do I get it right in that department? And then how do I carry it across my organization? So you certainly got my brain going this morning, which is always a good thing, as to me thinking about my own squeaky wheels, and we all have them, right?
It's
An
tricky.
opportunity, right? An opportunity to really game up the organization, right? So,
Yeah, I mean, one of the shocking things in the places that have traditionally got big turnover is that I don't think anybody actually believes there is any solution. I think they all kind of accept it as, well, this is just the industry. This is just how it is, especially in those high volume recruiters. To the extent they don't even look for a solution, they're not believing they can. They'll maybe change agencies now and again to try and save 1%, but fundamentally they're not even in the having a go at trying to do something about it. And that, for me, would be step one for many people is, oh no, there's way better ways you can do this. There are actual solutions. Your problem may be more complex than some, but there probably is a solution, and I think that's always a good starting point. You mentioned teams. Teams are more complex, right? So we do a lot of work in that area too, and understanding how a team and a team dynamic is. So one area, for instance, we're working on this now is we're working with sort of VC investors, and we will produce a team dynamic on the executive team. And just looking at the dynamic as a system rather than as individuals, we can way up front identify where their problems are going to be. So you're going to give them 20 million. Here's the wheels that are going to come off the bogey in 3 months, 6 months, 2 years' time. And here's why. And here's maybe what you want to do about that before that happens. So understanding a team makeup, you can also, if you zoom out and see their map, you can also see here are the potential issues that are most likely to affect this team. And again, awareness is half the solution. And usually the team can go, right, okay, how are we going to deal with that? And they can usually figure out solutions to that. It's just unfortunately they're completely blind to the fact that it is there. And I can see it. I mean, I had one case, I'll finish with this one, sorry, but I profiled the whole staff, 126 staff, and I put them all on the one map. And as soon as I did it, I realised, and I phoned the MD and I says, look, you're heading for some major problems if you don't make some adjustments. And he says, don't be daft, wouldn't listen to me because we're just off the back of our best year ever. We've just been winning awards, blah, blah, blah. And what the problem was, when I looked at, we have a wee island map that allows us to see the juxtaposition of personality types. And he had 124 people, pretty much all in the same area of the map. They were all just like him. Now, these people were generally wonderful at creating new business. He had 2 people in the entire organization who actually gave a crap about customers, right? These people would say those words, but none of them were losing sleep over it. They were all about kicking open new doors, getting new business. Nobody was any kind of maintenance person. And they had 2 of them, and they were the most stressed people in the organization. I met them both because they were losing sleep at night thinking, we're dropping the ball on these customers and nobody's listening to me and blah, blah. 6 months later, the MD was fired out of his own company and demoted, and his number 2 was put in place. A year later, there was a management buyout. 3 years later, there's no existence of the organisation whatsoever. They were in a finite market, and they ran out of new doors to knock on. And they had nobody properly supporting the customer base. And I could see that just from the map, nothing else, just from you don't have MD who's naturally cares about customers. And you could see that in a team dynamic.
Yeah, that's a great example because it highlights when things are going really well, you can't take your eye off the ball. There's a stage and cycle to every business, and what made you successful today isn't going to keep you successful tomorrow. So just great illustration there.
Yeah, it's that zooming out big picture side of things. And that's why the VCs quite like it, because they're all big picture. They don't read more than a page. You know what I mean? It's like you've really got to make it very straightforward, big pictures, but they can see something, and they're spending a lot of money. And VCs, for some reason, settle for about 1 in 10 successes, which for me is bonkers. I think I'd be looking for 10 out of 10 if it was my money, And the biggest part of that is going to be the team. What's the lady from Harvard? And she's got a book on this, and that was the one. 65% of all new starts with VC funding fail purely because the management team can't get it together. They don't get along. And that is unforgivable because that is easily fixable if you can see the moving parts.
Very true.
Well, I know we could talk for hours, not just because of the accent, Martin, but because of the topic. And there's so many more questions, but really thank you so much for coming on and sharing the stories and your experience with us. Martin has also generously given us a link that we'll share in the comments, and you could reach out to Jill or I through the podcast for a mini personality test if you want to take that, to be able to go through his and get an assessment from their side of things. You can find Martin at
completely
PeopleMaps.
free, by the way. There's no strings attached, no nothing. You won't be getting hassled. It's really just to give people a wee taste, nothing else.
I love them, so I know I'll be doing mine here shortly. But peoplemaps.com, Martin's book on retention, social media. Martin, really appreciate the conversation. It was intriguing. And again, we probably need to do a part 2, Jill, down the road. But any other final...
My part 2 is going to be in Scotland when I meet Martin, and maybe go play some golf and grab a pint with him. So that's on my list now.
Very welcome.
Well, thanks, everyone. Jill, any other final thoughts?
No, just want to thank you again, Martin. Fascinating topic. I think People Maps is just brilliant, and I'm really inspired by the work you're doing and the things you're bringing to organizations. I think there's so much broken out there in the world of talent, recruitment, and fit that this really makes a lot of sense, and I hope a lot of organizations look a little deeper and open their minds to using tools like this. So thanks again.
Okay, thanks for having me, guys. It's been real great fun. I've really enjoyed it.
Great.
Thanks, everyone, for listening. Don't forget to share, like, and follow, and we will speak with you soon. Have a great one.
Bye-bye.